Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining FSMA Friday. This is October 2021. My name is Aaron Bolshaw, the moderator for FSMA Fridays. And for anyone that's new, this is an ongoing monthly industry update for food and beverage facility operators, QA, safety, compliance professionals. And we here at SafetyChain team up with the Atchison Group to bring you guidance and thought leadership on a host of different topics, revolving around, of course, the Food Safety Modernization Act and all the stuff the FDA and FSMA has cooking. And today we're reviewing some news that seems to kind of line up nicely around the Halloween season. Some people think bioengineered foods, GMOs, and things of this nature are a little spooky. So we're going to talk about the National Bioengineered Foods Disclosure, get into some labeling, record keeping, look at some supplier risk issues, and of course, as always, we'll get to some of your questions here at the end. But for right now, just wanted to make sure everyone knows you're on mute. We do want to hear from you, though. There's probably going to be a lot of questions through the presentation, so if you would use the console on your right to send us questions. I'll be saving time at the end to discuss those. And today we'd like to introduce, we've got Eric Edmunds back from the Atchison Group. This is the guy that you want to have answer your questions. Again, he's got a really great combination of legal, regulatory, and food industry experience. He's been on FSMA Friday more times than I can count. So, and he is certified in HACCP, registered EHS, and with NEHA, and FSMA Preventative Controls qualified individual. So, with that, Eric, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aaron. It's great to be here. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. So I was reading a few interesting statistics actually about sort of bioengineered foods, and it really challenged my perception of what a bioengineered food is and what a GMO is. And I think that we'll maybe get into that a little bit. But you know, the U.S. planted 75 million hectares of biocrops in 2018, right? 64 countries require GMO labeling. 28 countries grow GM crops on about 475 million acres. This has been proliferating. This is here. This is now. And I think, you know, the FDA and FSMA has been thoughtful in their approach on how to provide guidance so that we give the marketplace and and the people that are purchasing our products the right information. But the global value of biotech crops right now is over 186 billion. So it's here, right? So why don't you, before we go into all of that stuff, I know there's just kind of a recap from the, just kind of some recent news from FSMA Friday. Eric, why don't you go through this, and then let's get into the heart of the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, on the FSMA FDA front, there's not a whole lot of regulatory updates, so I thought I would just share some happenings in the FDA world right now, as well as a little bit from Canada and USDA too. This webinar seems to be pretty broad at this point, just giving updates on everything. So the USDA announcing their efforts to reduce salmonella illnesses in poultry. Right now, they're really just in the information gathering phase, but they released a statement that they want to reduce salmonella illnesses in poultry by 25%. So we'll see how that goes. We've made progress on that in the past years, but there's still issues. And if you're following the news, you may have seen that there have been some petitions to label salmonella as an adulterant in food, or in poultry particularly, that coming from a group represented in submission by Bill Marler. But they kind of announced this in a response to that, and included some response there that they're not going to name it a per se adulterant, but they do want to reduce the instances. Romaine lettuce, obviously been in the news a lot the last few years for food safety issues, and the FDA has implemented more field testing programs where they're actually monitoring the overall presence of pathogens in romaine. And they just recently released a report from a sampling exercise that started last February in Yuma, Arizona. They tested over 500 samples. None of them tested positive for salmonella, and one tested positive for E. coli. And although it was deemed to be a potential food safety issue, It wasn't actually a strain of E. coli that has ever been associated with a foodborne illness. So it seems like the produce growers down in the Yuma, Arizona area are definitely doing a pretty good job of maintaining controls from land use next to them, things like that, some of the things that have been implicated in the romaine outbreaks. And then obviously whole genome sequencing is a big drive by the FDA, pushing for new technologies and everything. And they released a report that basically said it's doing its job. They have the genome tracker that they have out there that they do a whole genome sequence of all the pathogens that they find, whether it's on food, reported through hospitals and fecal samples from ill people, or even from facilities that they're inspecting and conducting swabathons. And the overall assessment basically said for every 1,000 sequences we get, we're reducing 6 foodborne illnesses. And so it's kind of paying for itself and reducing the amount of people that get sick. That goes through quicker tracking, quicker identification of sources, and just preventing more people from getting sick. Another interesting one was FDA released their annual report on sources of foodborne illnesses. This ends up just being a really good resource for everyone in the food industry to help identify and assess potential hazards in the foods that they may be working with, and just a good resource from a historical perspective on the possibilities of things like that. And then moving into kind of the next phase of FSMA, the new era of smarter food safety, the FDA is really pushing the food safety culture aspect of that. And it is very important for companies to have a strong food safety culture. And CAG's been doing a lot of work in that area as well. But FDA and Stop Foodborne Illness is beginning a webinar series to discuss food safety culture and give you a better idea of what that really means. And then the last one is a regulatory update. CFIA, I mean, they're slightly different than FSMA regulations, but they follow a lot of the same ideas. They just recently closed the comment period on their revised animal feed regulations, which is going to include some mandatory preventive controls, particularly for medicated feed and a whole lot of other changes that you may want to look into if you're dealing with animal foods in the Canadian market. But with that, we can jump into today's topic, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard. So we will get into some of those differences between GMOs and bioengineered and kind of why those terms were used and who's enforcing the law. But the general overview, we'll do a quick one just to say who has to comply, which products are implicated in the mandatory labeling disclosure, how you can actually make those disclosures, the record-keeping requirements, which is a pretty broad spectrum right now. Then supply chain controls, process validation, and product testing are really those records that you could be keeping to verify that you're in compliance or demonstrate that you're in compliance. And then we'll talk a little about the overall enforcement and risks of non-compliance from the food industry perspective. So really, when you think about this law, it's not a true food safety law. The science has really shown that bioengineered foods are safe as their conventional counterparts, but it's a consumer information law. People want to know if they're consuming bioengineered foods or what people commonly refer to as GMOs. And so any food that is sold at retail that falls into the requirements is going to have some sort of disclosure. And so looking at it, any packaged food, it's going to be the person who manufactures it or imports it. And if a retailer is making things in-house or selling bulk foods that don't have an outer package, they're going to be responsible for labeling the food to make consumers aware whether or not a bioengineered food is being sold or an ingredient within the food is bioengineered. So there are a few exemptions, which some of the consumer groups have a few issues with because, for example, food served in a restaurant or similar retail food establishment is not required to declare when they're serving bioengineered foods. And obviously a lot of people eat out or order in for their food. So there's not going to really be a mechanism for the consumer to know whether their restaurant or cafeterias and things like that are actually serving bioengineered food, it will be kind of restricted to the grocery store, packaged foods and things prepared in the grocery store. Also, very small food manufacturers are exempt from the rule. That's having less than $2.5 million in annual receipts. That really doesn't cover a lot of manufacturers. So the majority of packaged food and things you find in the grocery store will be required to comply with the rule. And then the last exemption is for food certified under the National Organic Program. The National Organic Program is implemented and kind of created by the USDA, and it has standards within it that does not allow for any GMO or bioengineered food to be produced under the organic standards and have the organic label. So that's a standard that the USDA has control over, that they can verify is going to comply with the expectations for the National Bioengineered Disclosure Standard. So it's included in there as an exemption. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of third-party exemptions and things like that in the record keeping section, or third-party certifications for non-GMO status. So those are the people that need to comply, and now we can kind of move into the products that are covered. And the definition is a little scientific. Basically, any food, including dietary supplements, that contain detectable genetic material that's been modified in a lab. So the in vitro is kind of the lab standard, when the modification cannot be found through conventional breeding or found in nature. So if you could show that, yes, this may have been done in a lab, but it could have occurred naturally, you may have some sort of argument, but that's going to be a steep hill to climb. So if you're working with something that's been modified, especially with transgenic modification, you're really going to be covered by the rule, and the food's going to be covered by the rule. There may be some debate on whether a cisgenic modification could actually occur in nature or be obtained through conventional breeding. But the interesting thing about this rule is enforced by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. But if you look at what foods are really subject to the disclosure standard, it's mostly the division comes through. If it's an FDA regulated food, you're going to be covered. If it's a USDA regulated food, you may not be. The USDA one has these two sub bullet points there where you have to go into your actual ingredient listing, and if the first ingredient is an FDA regulated food, then you would be covered. Or if the first ingredient is a broth or stock or water, something similar, and the second one would be FDA regulated, you'd be covered as well. So if you get into your chicken noodle soup that has chicken as the first ingredient, you're not covered. But if the first ingredient is water or noodles, and the second ingredient is the other, then you would be, because both of those first predominant ingredients, first and second, water and noodles, would be FDCA regulated food. So FDCA being the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, with the FDA's authorizing statutes. So there are some exemptions on the product level as well. Incidental additives. This really falls into the category, if you're familiar with food labeling. And so there's this, if you're a processing aid or something that ends up in the food at insignificant levels, or does not have any technical or functional effect on the food, you don't need to list it as an ingredient on your ingredient statement. And if that incidental additive happens to be in a bioengineered food, it's not going to make the whole food product subject to the disclosure. The next one being inadvertent or technically unavoidable presence. And this is up to 5% per ingredient. And the important thing to note here is that it's not intentional. So anytime you intentionally add a bioengineered ingredient, you are required to disclose. This up to 5% really falls into some of these things that, for example, a grain that may be bioengineered, you may be using a non-bioengineered ingredient, but the harvest equipment and transport equipment used to get that grain towards you may have previously harvested or carried a GMO ingredient, which ends up just through an unavoidable process. You may get small amounts of bioengineered grains or something in your product. You're not going to be held liable for that as long as it's below 5% per ingredient in your finished product. And then the last one, which I always find interesting, again, because USDA is enforcing this, but any food derived from an animal that consumed a bioengineered substance is exempt as well. So any pure meat products are not going to require disclosure. This one really gets into your dairy products and cheeses and things like that. Just because the cow or other animal is fed a bioengineered crop like corn or something does not mean the milk or cheese resulting from that milk is going to require disclosure. It would have to have an actual bioengineered ingredient added to the actual product. So the USDA has released this helpful list of foods that are known to be bioengineered that are produced for human consumption in the United States. So the list isn't necessarily exhaustive. The USDA will be updating it as they learn about more items, or they or the FDA approves more items, more bioengineered foods that will be publicly available. So this actually hasn't changed since the rule proposal. So it has your typical known products in there. But even since the list has been out there, there's been a pig that has been bioengineered that has been approved by the regulators for human consumption. And then, interestingly enough, there are other items that have been approved by the USDA, but they're not actually available or produced in the United States. There's some tomatoes and rices, plums, and flax seeds and things that have been approved but aren't commercially produced in the United States. So while this list is a great place to start, if you want to look into any of these ingredients you're using to verify that they're not the bioengineered version, or if they are, that you disclose it to the consumer. But there are other things out there on the global scale and even approved in the United States that just aren't really commercially available. So the way the USDA looks at it is if you have actual knowledge that you are using a bioengineered ingredient, even if it's not on this list, you will be required to disclose. So just because you're not on the list doesn't mean it's home free. It just means your job is likely a little bit more straightforward. So how do you disclose? The 4 options that the USDA has given are text, symbol, electronic or digital link, and a text message. So one of these options is kind of the one that I imagine more companies are looking into, that being the electronic or digital link. It basically allows you to include a scannable information that you can scan, and it would have to take you directly to a product web page that has one of these other disclosures there. So it can't go through any secondary channels or have to click here for more information again. It would have to have the information on the web page that it leads you to. But in a sense, you could include that in one of your scannable items already and not have to change your overall label format as much. And you wouldn't have to have kind of the out front text disclosure saying bioengineered food in a legible text, or the big symbol that I have there as an example on the side. That's the symbol that USDA put out. That there's a black and white version as well, that you could just stick that on your label somewhere and it would satisfy the requirement. And the last one being the text message, that's command word to the number for bioengineered food information. You'd have to have that kind of overall statement, and then it would follow the similar requirement as the electronic or digital link that goes directly to or responds with information that discloses the bioengineered status of the food.
Hey, Eric, on that, will you go back real quick? I do have a quick question. I want to make sure the slide's correct. Might have to go back one more. There we go. So on the your digital link. I'm starting to see these in the store. Okay, got it. But on the digital link, so you typically call those QR codes, right? Those little square, black and white checkered patterns. Does it have to say bioengineered, right? So the text message statement on the label says text, food info to 89467 for bioengineered food information. But on 3A here on this screen, it says scan here for more food information. Can you give a little more detail? Does it have to say bioengineered information?
No, it does not. So the things that I put in quotes on the slide are actually straight out of the rule, the required text. So scan here for more information for more food information is the required text that would be needed with the electronic or digital link, and it would not have to actually say bioengineered. And that's why I personally feel a lot of companies are going to go that way, because as you mentioned, there are a lot of people that are wary about consuming bioengineered foods, and it's not the most transparent way of doing it, but it is a way of basically putting the onus on the consumer to scan. Otherwise, they may not be aware of the factor. So while I don't necessarily support the non-transparent ways, it is a way that you can change your label as little as possible while still satisfying the requirement.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make, and I appreciate that. So is there any guidance yet on what that product page's layout or contents should include? So you scan it and then you see it. You're generally going to be on your smartphone in the aisle there, right? Is there any guidance about the layout or the content or what's described on that product page?
In the context of this rule, there's not really a lot of specification that basically says the scan must go directly to a product information page for that product and must contain either the text or symbol disclosure on that page. So no additional clicking, basically, to get the information.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. Voluntary disclosure. We kind of mentioned the people that are the kind of food businesses that may be exempt from the rule, either due to their sales size or the fact that they're a retail establishment. This basically just says, if you want to comply, go right ahead. And if you do, you need to follow the same mandatory disclosure standards that I just had listed in the previous slide. And the other one is disclosure of foods derived from bioengineering. So you can see the example image in this one is slightly different than the previous. The other one just said bioengineered in the letters around the image, while this says derived from bioengineered. This is largely for those products that, well, quite simply, come from a bioengineered food but don't contain any detectable DNA. So some of the products that are kind of the primary ones in here are going to be your highly refined oils or things that are processed. So even if you were to test them, they may come from a genetically modified or bioengineered ingredient, but since they've been processed, the DNA is no longer testable and you can't find it there. This is another optional one to the point where you may get a company that decides to be fully transparent and adds derived from bioengineering onto their label, whereas another product that is the exact same does not have the label because the DNA is not detectable. So that's kind of the optional one. And the quotations in this one are also used for the specific wording that you could use for a text disclosure, or kind of the QR code type scanning disclosure if you decided to go that route. So record keeping requirements, a big one here, and people are nervous about what type of records they need, and some of it, at least from what I've been working with, is actually inability to get some of these records from the supply chain. So there's really three categories that you can look into. And the USDA kind of says the customary and reasonable records. So for most companies, you already have records that are satisfying this type of standard, and they want to say use the records you already have, and just make sure they have the appropriate information. So whether that's a attestation from your supplier saying this is not a bioengineered crop or this is not a bioengineered ingredient, you could rely on that as your sole record. You would just have to explain and justify that to the USDA upon a potential inspection, or any other supply chain record showing what type of seeds were planted, or any contractual statement or broker statement. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about third-party certifications. So the reason why there's not an outright exemption for third-party certifications is because the USDA doesn't have any control over that standard. So for example, the non-GMO project likely has records that exceed any standard or expectation of USDA, but since that could change without USDA's knowledge, and they don't have any control over it, they haven't included it as a out-and-out exemption, but you could use those records to verify that you are dealing with a non-bioengineered product or ingredient. It's just, you want to verify that it truly aligns with the USDA standard, but you're probably not going to have a huge lift to do that. The other ones that are really causing some questions and consternation out there, laboratory testing results or validated process verification. So the USDA has released some general guidance on both of these topics, which is available on their website, but generally laboratory testing results, you can test all incoming ingredients for modified genetic material and get a negative result, and that could be basically the entirety of your record keeping program. It's resource and cost intensive, obviously, so it's easier if you can work with your suppliers to get that information directly from them instead of doing your additional testing. And the USDA guidance basically says, PCR quantitative data is really the most common and the one that you're using, that most people are using here. New technologies may come out that are better, and PCR may have some limitations. So when you're looking at it, you want to make sure you choose a lab that has appropriate accreditation to work on the food products that you're doing. So ISO accreditations and things like that, and that they have the real capability to run the test, so you can rely on it. And then the other one being the validated process verification. This deals with these ones that I mentioned earlier that are derived from bioengineered ingredients but are processed to the point that the DNA is no longer detectable. And that basically says you can, just like any process control in your food production facility, you can validate a process to verify that if it goes through this process, meets this, so this type of food goes through this type of temperature treatment or any other type of treatment, and we've tested the final product and it always eliminates all detectable DNA, you can rely on that information instead of going back to supply chain records and additional testing on your part, as long as you can verify that it's gone through this validated process that eliminates detectable genetic material. And the last one, they listed all the examples there that are fairly comprehensive, but they always recognize if you have something else that you think could be useful and explain or justify your situation, feel free to use those, and it's open-ended on the other records for what you could use. So just to close out, so enforcement and risks of non-compliance. So the mandatory compliance date coming up pretty quick, beginning of next year. So if you haven't already been working on this, you've got a decent amount of work to do working with your supply chains or just labeling products, changing labels as needed. So I urge you to act quickly if you're not already on top of this. But generally, the enforcement, like I said, enforced by the USDA. They haven't really said they're going to be very active in this area. In fact, the way the rule is set up, it's more set up so your consumers can make complaints to the USDA. The USDA will do an initial assessment of the complaint to see if it has any validity to it or is kind of reasonable. And then at that point, they would request records or visit you to audit your records to see if you can justify why you don't have a disclosure on the product. So after that, there'd be an opportunity to contest any negative findings. But the real thing here is after that assessment, they'll make the results public. So interestingly enough, the USDA will not have authority to issue a recall or impose civil penalties for violation. But that's why the results being made public becomes kind of the true enforcement mechanism, because while states can't change the disclosure standard of the USDA, the bioengineered disclosure standard, they could change civil penalties within a state law that reflects this, so you can be subject to those on a state level. But probably the one that you're likely to see sooner are consumer protection laws. So anything that could be determined to be misleading or false. And if there's already a government statement out there saying, we audited this company and they did not have the records for justifying the fact that they're not disclosing bioengineered ingredients, that's going to open you up to a world of hurt in the liability sector from consumer protection laws. So you probably expect a lot of those to be brought in the states where you already see a lot of consumer protection food cases. So with California's and New York's, and I mean, there's other states getting involved there too, but that's where the real financial risk comes into play. But the USDA has been a little bit hamstrung in the sense that their enforcement mechanisms as a government agency don't really have a lot of teeth, but they can do the legwork to allow a consumer plaintiff's attorney to bring lawsuits with all the work already done for them. But with that, we're right up at time, but I'm available. So if there's any questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer.
Oh yeah, there's a few. I kind of figured there'd be a few of these, Eric, but yeah. So a couple of questions. So one came in a little bit earlier, and I didn't stop you while you were on that slide, and I just wanted to kind of mention it. Margaret asked, are products that have the non-GMO project certification considered non-bioengineered as well? And do they, second question part to that is, do they fulfill all of the bioengineered food disclosure regulations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because the non-GMO project has put in a lot of effort to be the leader in that category for the most part. And while they're kind of, as I mentioned, they're not named specifically as an exemption, from what I've reviewed, they would meet these exemptions, but you'd be using your non-GMO project certification as the record for verifying. So it's not guaranteed that it's going to be perfectly aligned with the USDA regulations. So you may want to do a little bit of background work, but I'm assuming and guessing for the most part, anyone who has that certification is going to look at their stringent requirements of that standard and say that this satisfies all the requirements of the USDA rule. You'll just want to watch out for any changes to that standard in the future, or things that don't align with the USDA expectations.
Great. Yeah, we got a few questions. I hope you can stay for a little bit. We're going to keep the questions going because these are great. Next one, Kelly asks, is there an exemption for institutional products to not have to update their label? She says, I know we need to have documentation on file for consumer inquiries.
Yeah, so most institutional kind of category things, they're going to fall into that retail establishment or other similar establishment where they're probably not going to have to announce that out in public. So I mean, I think I would need a little more specific information to speak to that specific case, but yeah, so it's a little difficult to answer exactly for that. Okay,
got it. So here's one. Do the labeling requirements, Amanda's asking, do the labeling requirements apply to warehouse and distributors who receive bulk produce and repack it? which with no branding, just a clear bag with traceable info.
So they're repackaging us. Yeah, it would apply. I mean, if you're repacking produce as a warehouse and changing the label and the kind of overall size and everything, and this is kind of off the top of my head, but you would be considered the manufacturer that would be required to put that disclosure. If it stays in that package at the retail level, yeah, you would bear responsibility to either carry on the information you receive from your suppliers or add it yourself.
Yeah, and if you're passing it along, I would just offer a recommendation and open up that line of communication now with your supplier and where you're shipping that, so that we have a clear understanding, right? Some of the times that things get mixed up here is when somebody thinks somebody's doing something and it's not happening. I think open up that line of communication, Amanda, and really document that so everyone involved has a clear understanding of what's happening. So is the next one, Eric, is a disclosure needed if no BE ingredients are there, or just if there is a BE ingredient, right? Like, so there's no disclosure needed, right? If somebody says they don't have to disclose that it is not bioengineered, right? However, I think this teeters on the line of certification versus labeling, right?
Yeah, so yeah, the standard exists to notify consumers of when BE ingredients are present. If there are no BE ingredients at present, then you're good. There's not any specification for saying not bioengineered. It's more of a notice rule.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of redirect that. We really didn't cover today, nor do we have time, the other side of that, which is, hey, you do get certification non-GMO, things of that nature. That's an off topic that we didn't cover. We didn't cover today, but we may want to in the future. So thanks for that question, Samuel. Where do we get this? Oh, somebody asked where we get the logo. They have Mettler scales and our specs. So the logos that we showed, Eric, earlier about the bioengineered, are those available through the FDA?
The USDA.
So I'm sorry, USDA.
Examples are, yeah.
Cool. All right, Jill, that's you'll be able to find some of that USDA. So very good. Is the phone number after you scan or below the QR code? So I think Brian asked this. We don't need both. We need one or the other. Byron, excuse me. What we need is, if we go back here, let me just, because I thought there might be a couple of.
I know what he's saying. You need both. So on an electronic or digital link, scan here for more food information. Must be accompanied by a phone number on that label. And that's largely because if someone doesn't have a smartphone, they are entitled to this information as well, and you have to provide a means for them to get it, even if they don't have a smartphone. So both of those are required on the product label.
Yeah, and there's no guidance on where that needs to go. However, I would recommend it's co-located, right? And you just want to work with your branding and labeling folks to make sure it looks good and that it's clearly understood.
Yeah, it's going to fall into the standard of you're not going to want any intervening material between those two statements. Otherwise, you could just have a floating phone number out there that someone wouldn't know what it does or wouldn't know how to find it when they're actually looking at the thing. So yeah, that's going to be no intervening material next to each other. Even though they're in 2 bullet points on the slide, it's really one information requirement.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, thanks, Eric. Further recommendation would be also, after this is set up, make sure you call that number, make sure it's working, okay? Sometimes some people forget to do something and it's a really important big thing that you need to do. So Polly's got another question about the QR code. Can the code direct to the same page for a variety of products, or does it have to be product specific? Is there any guidance?
It has to go to that. From my understanding, it has to go to that product page. You can't do a kind of all-encompassing one. It has to go specifically to a product information for the product that they're scanning.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you said something earlier, Eric, that makes it really simple to understand. Once somebody hits that page, they shouldn't have to click anywhere else to find the information they're looking for while they're standing in the aisle. So, Polly, that's a great question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another one. So if I know I'm using sucrose from sugar beet that was bioengineered, I am sure there's no detectable bioengineered material present due to the processing. Do I still need to label BE? That's a great specific example that you talked about, Eric, about, hey, if you refine it, if you process it to a point where there's no detectable DNA, what would you say about sugar beet?
I used oils, highly refined oils as the example, but that's the other prime example. So it really depends on how sure you are. If you're sure because you have a validated processing step in there that eliminates everything in there, all the detectable genetic material, then you do not have to label. If you do not have a validated process to eliminate detectable genetic material, and you don't have other records that through product testing or anything else, then you would. So It all really depends on the strength of your validation of that process, and how confident you are, rather than just saying it shouldn't be there because it was processed.
Yeah, you should still test. Let's see if you can figure it out. So, but yeah, that's good. Good advice. Thank you, Eric. We have so many that I'm going to start skipping through some of these. Jose's got a question. I think it bears repeating just in sort of one final fashion. Is bioengineered the same as GMO? What's the difference, if any? I really think that this is something, we still want to cover very clearly, right?
Yeah, and wasn't on my, but it's a great point. And so there's scientifically, when you think about our food industry in general right now, genetically modified organisms is what GMO stands for. Most everything we eat has been genetically modified in some way through human intervention. So our chickens grow with larger breast meat. The cows produce more milk. Even if you go back to the very initiation of kind of genetic experimentation with Mendel and doing yellow peas and green peas, he was intentionally crossbreeding these different peas to see what the different results are. So there are lots of conventional breeding techniques, breeding a tomato that just naturally has a greater drought resistance with a tomato that's sweeter, and getting their crossbreed to be the more commonly used product because of palatability and drought resistance. Almost everything we eat is genetically modified in some sense. So that's where bioengineered kind of changes that conjecture, saying this is done in vitro in a laboratory under controlled conditions, that is kind of like the next level in the scientific process. So that's why it's not the GMO disclosure standard, because then essentially there's a real solid legal argument that everything would require the disclosure. This way it at least reduces that aspect into the things that are done more so in a lab using more modern techniques.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It bears repeating, and I encourage everyone to do a little bit of research on your own as well. Dig into some of these things. Understanding this is important. We've got far too many other questions to get to. However, I do want to get to this one. I think this is interesting because a lot of what we were talking about is sort of on that retail side. I keep saying, oh, I'm standing in that aisle at the grocery store. Mike asks, if you sell a non-retail packaged food to a food service company, do you need to do the bioengineered disclosure?
This may be oversimplification, but no. When you're getting into it, so the food service company may request the information, but you wouldn't necessarily be required to give it then to them unless the requirement only comes in when you're selling a retail packaged food or selling a food at retail. And then the food service one would be exempt, so they wouldn't be required to share that information either. They may want it for a voluntary disclosure or just for their information, but no, it's really at the consumer level. The business to business supply chain doesn't have to have any out-facing label.
Great. Here's an easy one. I think it's easy. I think maybe not. If your supplier, so on the heels of Mike's question, Dia asked this: if your supplier does state their product is bioengineered, do we still need to test?
Good question. And this actually brings up a funny example. So basically, the question was, well, what if I don't want to do all the supply chain work? What if I just label everything as bioengineered? Technically, what is the USDA going to audit in that sense? They're going to say, well, you don't have records. What they're really going to be auditing and looking into is, do you have records that demonstrate you do not need the disclosure? But if you're disclosing already, what would they be auditing? So that's kind of the question there. If they're saying this is a bioengineered ingredient, I mean, you can trust them and carry that on and put it on your package. It's where you don't have the information and don't want to do the disclosure is where you really have to do the legwork.
Good. Listen, there's a ton. We could just keep going. We still have hundreds of people on the line. We're going to wrap this up, though. We do need to get to some other things. Eric, I want to thank you. There is actually Patricia. Thank you for texting. We're going to make sure everyone that wants a copy of this presentation and ask for it, we're going to follow up with you and get it to you. Okay. Patricia also gave us the USDA site about the rules from AMS, about the frequently asked questions. Patricia, thank you for that. We'll make sure that everyone on the line gets that as well. And I think that's fantastic. You guys are helping us out. So that'll do it. We've got a few things coming up. Of course, you can always go back to the FSMA Friday recordings on SafetyChain. If you have not done so, the next thing you're going to do after you get off the phone with us is you're going to go sign up for the tag newsletter. It is insanely powerfully perfect. It is the one thing you want to read every time it comes into your inbox. So please sign up for that newsletter. You can find us on LinkedIn. Go check us out. Go sign up. Let's get you in the FSMA Friday LinkedIn group, right? We have some stuff coming up, a little bit more on the production side of the house for sure, but we've got a November of OEE. So we're really ramping up production in November with 2 webinars, one intro to OEE, why we want it, what its use case is, and believe it or not, there's some overlap with FSQA. So, and then really kind of the second one is moving the OEE needle, tips for surpassing 85%. That is, by the way, for an OEE score, extremely high, very, very hard to hit. But so those are coming up. Then November 18th, we've got Understanding the 4 Amendments to SQF Edition 9. We're going to be, SafetyChain is hosting or sponsoring the SQFI roundtable. So join us over there if you are in the SQF space and need some more information about those 4 amendments. We're going to be covering that. And then finally, we do have the next FSMA Friday. Remember, it's a week early. We've got Thanksgiving coming up, folks, but we do want to talk about supply chain labor shortage. So some people actually had some questions about that, but we didn't get to it. So please join us for all that stuff. Eric, thank you so much as always for joining us, and I appreciate everyone staying on a little bit extra and answering some questions with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here, and I'll look forward to the next one.
All right. Thanks again, Eric. All right, everyone, that's it. We'll wrap it up. Go have a happy Halloween. Don't get too scared about bioengineered foods. We'll see you later.
Yeah. Thank you.